Why states are secretly preparing for the dollar's collapse. Right now, in state capitals, most Americans have never thought twice about lawmakers are quietly rewriting the rules of money itself. Not with speeches, not with press conferences, with tax code, with legal tender statutes, with bullion depositories built in plain sight. 45 states have already made their move. Only 5 are left standing in the old system. And the reason isn't political. It isn't about gold prices or inflation headlines or Wall Street speculation. It's about something far more unsettling. A slow, deliberate hedge built by the very governments that are supposed to trust the currency they issue. So the question isn't whether this is happening. It's why your state government would need a backup plan for the dollar at all. Stay with this video because by the end, you'll understand exactly what they know and what almost no one else is watching for. Welcome back to Precious Metals Intelligence, the channel built for people who track the decisions institutions make quietly, long before the public ever notices. If you're new here, this is where strategic economic shifts get analyzed before they become headlines. Before we go further, where are you watching from today? Drop your state or country in the comments below. This channel has viewers tracking sound money policy from all 50 states and dozens of countries, and it helps to know exactly who's paying attention to these developments alongside us. To understand why state governments are moving away from the dollar system, one must first understand the scale of the problem they are responding to. The United States national debt has now crossed $40 trillion. This is not a small number that can be dismissed as background noise. It represents a level of government borrowing that has no historical precedent in American history. And with that level of debt comes a difficult truth that most political leaders avoid saying out loud. The value of the dollar is being slowly eroded year after year through the mechanics of inflation and continuous currency expansion. For decades, the federal government has printed money to cover its spending. This is not a controversial claim. It is simply how the system has worked since the dollar was disconnected from gold in 1971. Every time new currency enters the economy, without new production to back it, the value of every existing dollar becomes a little smaller. It happens slowly. It happens quietly. Most people never notice it in real time. They notice it later when their savings buy less than they used to, when their paycheck stretches less far than it did 5 years earlier. State lawmakers, however, have started to notice this pattern much earlier than the average citizen, and they have started responding to it in a way that is easy to miss unless someone is paying close attention. They are not making public declarations against the dollar. They are not holding press conferences to announce a loss of confidence in federal monetary policy. Instead, they are doing something quieter and, in many ways, more significant. They are rewriting state law to make it easier for citizens to hold gold and silver as a form of protection. This shift did not happen overnight. It has been building since around 2022, when a small number of states began reconsidering how they treated precious metals under their tax codes. Since then, the movement has grown steadily, state by state, often without much national media attention. It is the kind of trend that develops in the background, while the public focuses on more immediate headlines. The legal foundation for this movement is not new. It comes directly from the United States Constitution, specifically Article 1, Section 10. This section states clearly that no state shall make anything except gold and silver coin a legal tender for the payment of debts. This clause has existed since the founding of the country. For most of American history, it was treated as a historical footnote, rarely discussed and rarely applied. Now, state lawmakers are returning to it as a serious legal principle, one that gives them constitutional grounds to treat gold and silver as real money rather than as ordinary consumer goods. This distinction matters more than it may first appear. When a state treats gold and silver as consumer goods, it applies sales tax to them, the same way it would apply sales tax to furniture or electronics. But when a state treats gold and silver as money, that tax no longer makes logical sense. A person does not pay sales tax when they exchange a $100 bill for 5 $20 bills at a bank. Under the same logic, many lawmakers now argue a person should not pay sales tax when they exchange paper currency for physical gold or silver. It is simply one form of money being converted into another. This is the quiet legal and philosophical shift taking place across the country right now. It is not being driven by panic. It is not being driven by dramatic predictions of imminent collapse. It is being driven by a slow, methodical recognition among certain lawmakers that the dollar's long-term trajectory is uncertain, and that citizens deserve legal protection if they choose to hold alternative forms of wealth. What makes this trend worth watching closely is its consistency. It has continued through different political administrations, different economic conditions, and different public moods. It has not slowed down. If anything, it has accelerated. And as more states join this movement, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. The next part of this story will examine exactly how this shift plays out in practice, through a real case that shows what happens when a state moves in the wrong direction and then has to correct course. A law can sound small on paper and still cause massive damage in practice. This is exactly what happened in the state of Maryland, and it offers one of the clearest examples of why the sales tax on precious metals has become such a contested issue across the country. Before 2025, Maryland had a simple rule in place. Anyone purchasing gold or silver worth more than $1,000 did not have to pay sales tax on that purchase. This exemption existed because lawmakers understood a basic principle. Precious metals function as money, not as ordinary retail goods. But in 2025, the state legislature reversed this policy. A new law was passed that applied sales tax to nearly all gold and silver purchases, with only one narrow exception. Buyers could avoid the tax only if they made their purchase in person, inside a specific building in Baltimore. The consequences arrived almost immediately, and they were severe. Local coin and bullion dealers across Maryland reported losing more than 70% of their sales volume within a short period of time. This was not a gradual decline. It was a sudden collapse. Customers did not stop buying gold and silver. They simply stopped buying it in Maryland. Many of them crossed state lines into neighboring states that did not impose the same tax. Others turned to online dealers based outside Maryland entirely. The result was that the state did not gain meaningful tax revenue from this policy. Instead, it pushed an entire industry out of its own borders. Small business owners were the ones who felt this the hardest. These were not large corporations with the flexibility to absorb a sudden drop in sales. Many were family-run coin shops that had operated in their communities for years, sometimes decades. For these business owners, a 70% drop in volume was not a manageable setback. It was an existential threat to their livelihood. This is where two Maryland lawmakers stepped forward. Delegate Wayne Hartman and Senator J.B. Jennings began working closely with sound money advocacy groups to reverse the damage. They introduced new legislation, Senate Bill 309 and House Bill 500, designed specifically to repeal the tax penalty and restore the previous exemption. Their approach was methodical. They gathered research on the economic impact of the law. They brought small business owners to speak directly with other lawmakers. They rallied thousands of residents across the state to support the change. Senator Jennings later explained the core issue in simple terms. When a government taxes precious metals, it does not just affect the individual buyer. It creates a burden that spreads through the entire state economy, hurting local businesses, discouraging investment, and pushing commerce into other states. This argument resonated with enough lawmakers that the bill succeeded. Maryland restored its exemption, and Hartman and Jennings were later recognized for their work with the Sound Money Legislator of the Year award. What makes the Maryland case so important is not simply that the exemption was restored. It is what the entire episode revealed about the real-world consequences of treating gold and silver as ordinary taxable goods. When a state applies sales tax to precious metals, it does not create a stable new source of revenue. Instead, it drives away commerce, damages local businesses, and pushes citizens toward markets in other states or online where the transaction cannot be taxed at all. The Maryland experiment functioned almost like a controlled test case for the rest of the country. It demonstrated, in a very public and very costly way, what happens when a state moves in the wrong direction on this issue. Other states have been watching closely. Lawmakers in different parts of the country have referenced Maryland's experience directly when introducing their own sound money legislation, using it as evidence for why sales tax exemptions on precious metals make economic sense. In this way, Maryland's costly mistake became a valuable lesson for the broader movement. It sped up momentum in other states rather than slowing it down. The next part of this story moves beyond a single state and examines how this pattern has spread across the entire country, from Alaska's sweeping new legal tender law to Wisconsin's multi-year tax elimination effort, and what it means that only 5 states remain outside this growing trend. While Maryland's story unfolded on the East Coast, a very different but equally significant development was taking shape more than 3,000 miles away in Alaska. Unlike Maryland, Alaska does not have a statewide sales tax. But that did not mean gold and silver purchases were free from taxation. Local municipal governments across the state still held the power to apply their own sales taxes to precious metals purchases, creating a patchwork of inconsistent rules depending on where a person happened to live. State Representative Kevin McCabe set out to fix this problem, and his effort was not a quick one. He spent 5 years developing and refining legislation that would address the issue at its root. That work finally paid off in May 2026, when his bill, House Bill 1, was signed into law. This legislation accomplished 2 important goals at once. First, it eliminated local sales tax assessments on gold and silver coins, bars, and rounds across the entire state, closing the loophole that allowed individual municipalities to tax precious metals transactions. Second, and perhaps more significantly, it formally reaffirmed gold and silver as legal constitutional tender under Alaska law. This second point deserves particular attention. Alaska was, at one point, only a matter of years away from removing silver from its own coinage and monetary references entirely. Representative McCabe noted that House Bill 1 gives Alaskan residents direct, unrestricted access to assets that hold their value against inflation, while also bringing the state's laws into closer alignment with the original text of the United States Constitution. For a state that joined the Union relatively recently in American history, this represented a meaningful return to founding monetary principles. Alaska was not acting alone. Around the same time, attention turned to Wisconsin, where State Representative Shea Sortwell and State Senator Rachel Cabral Guevara had been working for several years on a similar mission. Over the course of 3 years, their efforts led to the complete elimination of Wisconsin's sales tax on gold and silver. Then, in early 2026, Governor Tony Evers signed Senate Bill 748, a follow-up measure that removed a series of administrative requirements that had previously made it more difficult for buyers to complete precious metals transactions. Together, these two pieces of legislation represented a complete, multi-year effort to clear away every tax and bureaucratic obstacle standing between ordinary citizens and sound money. When these individual state stories are placed side by side, a much larger pattern comes into focus. This is no longer a handful of isolated policy changes happening in different corners of the country for unrelated reasons. As of now, 45 out of 50 states have eliminated or partially eliminated sales taxes on precious metals. That leaves only 5 states that still impose a sales tax on gold and silver purchases: Hawaii, Washington, New Mexico, Maine, and Vermont. Policy analysts who track this movement closely expect new exemption bills to be introduced in nearly all 5 of these remaining states during the next legislative session. If even a portion of these bills succeed, the number of holdout states could shrink even further, leaving only 1 or 2 states standing apart from what has become a near-unanimous national trend. What makes this pattern so significant is its consistency across very different political environments. Maryland, Alaska, and Wisconsin are not similar states. They have different populations, different political leanings, different economic structures, and different legislative priorities. Yet lawmakers in all 3 reach the same conclusion through independent processes, that taxing gold and silver as ordinary consumer goods no longer makes sense in the current economic environment. This is not a regional trend limited to one part of the country. It is a national realignment, moving forward one state legislature at a time. The speed of this movement is also worth noting. Much of this progress has occurred within just the past few years, accelerating rather than slowing down. Each successful case, like Alaska's House Bill 1 or Wisconsin's multi-year tax elimination, becomes a reference point that other state lawmakers point to when introducing similar legislation in their own states. In this way, the movement has built its own internal momentum, with each new state adding pressure on the small number that remain. The next part of this story moves beyond tax policy altogether and examines something even more consequential: the physical infrastructure some states are now building, from bullion depositories to gold-backed financial instruments, and what this deeper level of preparation reveals about how seriously these governments are treating the question of monetary stability. Removing a sales tax is one kind of policy decision. Building physical infrastructure is another kind entirely. And this is exactly where the sound money movement has started to go next, moving past legislative language and into something far more tangible: real facilities, real storage systems, and real financial instruments designed to function independently of the traditional dollar-based banking system. The clearest example of this shift comes from Texas. In recent years, Texas established its own state-run bullion depository, a secure facility built specifically to store gold and silver on behalf of individuals, businesses, and even government entities. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is a functioning piece of financial infrastructure, built and maintained by the state itself, separate from the federal banking system and separate from private depositories located outside state control. In effect, Texas built its own version of a reserve vault, one that operates under state authority rather than federal oversight. This matters because it represents a different level of commitment compared to a simple tax exemption. A tax exemption removes a barrier. A depository creates a new option. It gives residents and institutions a place to store wealth in a form that does not depend on the continued stability of paper currency. And it does so within a legal framework the state itself controls. Few other states have gone this far, which is part of what makes the Texas Depository such a notable case study for lawmakers elsewhere who are considering similar steps. Alongside physical depositories, another development has emerged that deserves attention: gold-backed currency instruments, sometimes referred to as gold-backed notes. These are physical notes that carry a set exchange value tied directly to a specific amount of gold. They function differently from ordinary paper currency because their worth is not based on government promise alone. It is tied to a fixed quantity of a physical asset. Some critics have pointed out that these notes often carry a noticeable premium above the raw value of the gold they represent, and this criticism is fair on the surface. However, this premium is also part of what allows the notes to function as a usable medium of exchange in daily transactions. The exchange rate tied to each note is what gives it practical utility, allowing it to move from person to person in a way that raw, unmeasured gold cannot easily do. In this sense, the premium is not simply an inefficiency. It is the mechanism that makes the instrument usable at all, while still keeping its value anchored to a real physical asset, rather than to government policy alone. Taken together, these developments point to something larger than a series of unconnected experiments. A state that eliminates sales tax on gold and silver is signaling a legal preference. A state that builds a bullion depository or supports a gold-backed note system is signaling something closer to structural preparation. It suggests that certain state governments are not simply making it easier for individuals to buy precious metals. They are building the early framework for alternative financial systems that could operate with some degree of independence from the federal currency structure, should that independence ever become necessary. It is worth being clear about what this does not mean. It does not mean the dollar is expected to collapse suddenly or without warning. Most serious analysts do not expect a sudden currency collapse. What these developments point to instead is a slower, more gradual erosion of the dollar's purchasing power over time, the kind of erosion that has already been underway for years, driven by continuous currency expansion and rising national debt. In that context, physical infrastructure like the Texas Depository or instruments like gold-backed notes function less like doomsday preparation and more like a long-term hedge, quietly built years before most citizens are likely to feel the need for one themselves. The final part of this story will bring these threads together, examining what this entire movement means for ordinary citizens, business owners, and investors, and why the pace of change happening at the state level deserves far more attention than it currently receives.